Have you ever wondered what would happen if two planets, each with its own life, its own cultures, its own history, suddenly smashed into each other? Well, that's basically what happened on Earth back in 1492. We're going to dive into what happens when two worlds kept apart for thousands of years finally meet. I mean, really think about that question. This isn't just about ships and explorers and dates. It's about a massive biological and cultural collision that would literally reshape the planet. Everything from the food we eat to the borders on our maps today can be traced right back to this moment. The consequences were absolutely profound, and honestly, we're still living with them. So, let's paint a picture of the world right before the collision in 1491. On one side of the Atlantic, you've got the Americas, a vast space with incredible empires and thousands of unique societies, all of which developed in total isolation. On the other side, you have Europe, and specifically Spain, which was itching to find new trade routes and was really driven by that powerful trio, God, glory, and gold. You're looking at two completely separate human experiments that are about to crash into one another. And what was the spark that lit this incredible fire? It was a single voyage. When Christopher Columbus somehow convinced the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, to bankroll his crazy idea of sailing west, he kicked off a chain reaction that would change the world forever. For pretty much all of human history, the Atlantic Ocean was this massive, impassable wall. But then, thanks to better ships, better navigation, and a whole lot of ambition, it just wasn't anymore. All of a sudden, it became an aquatic highway, and the traffic on that highway would connect the world in ways no one could have ever imagined. So, this new connection is made. What's the very first result? Well, it's something historians have a name for: the Columbian Exchange. And this wasn't just about a few new trading goods. This was a fundamental rewiring of the entire planet's ecosystem. So, what is it exactly? Put simply, the Columbian Exchange was the massive movement of animals, plants, technology, people, and ideas between the Americas and the rest of the world. And as we're about to see, its impact was absolutely staggering and deeply, deeply unequal. Okay, just look at this balance sheet, because it is fascinating. Europe gets things like potatoes and maize, corn, which totally transforms their agriculture and leads to a huge population boom. The Americans get horses, which completely revolutionizes life for native peoples on the plains. But then you get to the bottom half of the list. Europe sent guns and steel, sure, but it also sent killer diseases like smallpox. In return, the Americas gave the world tobacco, and maybe syphilis, though historians are still fighting over that one. And this right here is the absolute key to understanding everything that happened next. This was a wildly uneven exchange. The Europeans showed up with steel swords, guns, and horses, a massive technological advantage. But their most powerful weapon, the thing that did the most damage, was completely invisible. Because the peoples of the Americas had been isolated for so long, they had zero immunity to old world diseases. Their unique history became their greatest weakness. So you've got this incredible imbalance of power. What comes next? You guessed it, conquest. And what's really wild is how the Spanish conquistadors basically developed a repeatable playbook for taking down enormous, wealthy empires with just a handful of soldiers. Just look at Hernán Cortés and his strategy against the Aztec Empire. This wasn't just brute force. It was a masterclass in psychological and political warfare. First, he found a translator, the absolutely indispensable La Malinche. Then, and this is the brilliant part, he didn't just attack the Aztecs. He listened, and he found out who their local enemies were. He made alliances with people like the Tlaxcalans, turning his foreign invasion into a massive local rebellion that he got to lead. And this playbook was terrifyingly effective. A few years later, Francisco Pizarro basically copied it to take down the Inca Empire in Peru. He marched inland with only 180 men. I mean, think about that. He found an empire already in the middle of a civil war and exploited those divisions. He used trickery to capture the Inca emperor, Atahualpa, demanded a room full of gold for his release, and then killed him anyway. It was a single, treacherous act that decapitated the entire empire. So winning the war is one thing, but how did a tiny number of Spaniards manage to control these huge territories and millions of people for centuries? The answer isn't in weapons, but in the systems they built. Clever and often brutal systems of labor and social control. The first major system they came up with was the Encomienda. Now, on paper, it sounds almost feudal. A Spanish colonist was entrusted with a group of Native Americans. They would provide the labor, and in return, he would protect them, pay them, and teach them about Christianity. But the reality? Yeah, it was basically slavery in all but name, a system of brutal forced labor. But not everybody was okay with this. There were some voices screaming out against the cruelty. The loudest belonged to a man named Bartolomé de Las Casas. He was a friar who had seen the horrors of the system firsthand, and he spent his life fighting for the rights of Native Americans, writing shocking accounts that put huge pressure on the King of Spain to do something. And believe it or not, his campaigning worked, kind of. In 1542, Spain passed the new laws to try and curb the worst abuses. The Encomienda system was slowly phased out and replaced with another system, the repartimiento. Now, this was still a system of forced labor, but it was much more regulated by the crown. So a small step, maybe, but the fundamental idea of coercion was still there. And this right here shows you how they controlled society. They created a rigid social pyramid based on race, called the Casta System. At the very, very top, you had people born in Spain. Right below them were people of pure Spanish blood, but born in the Americas. And together, they made up maybe 2% of the population. Just 2%. The other 98%, people of mixed heritage, and especially Native Americans and enslaved Africans at the very bottom, had little to no power. It was a system designed to keep a tiny elite in charge. So, we've walked through the conquest and the systems of control. But what's the long-term legacy? What was the final indelible mark left by this collision of worlds? When we talk about the costs of history, it's easy to think in terms of gold or land or power. But the most staggering cost of this encounter was measured in human lives. Just let that number sink in. By 1570, not even 100 years after Columbus arrived, the native population of the Americas had dropped by an estimated 90%. It is one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in all of human history, and it was driven almost entirely by those invisible weapons, the diseases for which they had no defense. And this demographic collapse had a truly horrifying ripple effect. For the Spanish colonists, all these deaths created a massive labor shortage. Their solution was to look across the Atlantic again, but this time to Africa. They began the transatlantic slave trade, kicking off one of the other most tragic chapters in human history. And really, that brings us to the big takeaway. This isn't just ancient history, it's living history. The patterns that were set 500 years ago, the economic relationships, the social structures, those racial hierarchies of the Casta system, they didn't just vanish. They left a deep, deep imprint on the Americas, an imprint that continues to shape our societies, our politics, and our cultures to this very day.